A mail-order bride got on the wrong coach, ended up marrying his twin brother by accident. The day she showed up on my porch, I had blood on my shirt from a fence post and mud on both boots clear to the ankle, and the only thing I could think to say was that I wasn't Callum. She was standing there with a canvas bag in each hand and a hat box tucked under one arm, and she looked at me the way a person looks at a map when the road they've been following runs out into scrub. Not afraid. Not even particularly surprised, I think, just recalculating. She set one of the bags down in the dirt, didn't drop it, set it down deliberate, and said, "You're not Callum." "No, ma'am. You look like him." "I know. He sent his photograph." "I know that, too." She looked out at the yard a moment. Just past me at the house with its porch screen half off the hinge and the pump handle wrapped in burlap where I'd cracked it back in February. Then she looked back at me. "Which coach stop is this?" "Dellard's Crossing." She took a breath in through her nose, slow. "I was meant for Whitmore Creek." "That's 11 miles north." She nodded once, picked the bag back up off the dirt, and then she said, "Well, I suppose I'll need somewhere to be while I figure out what comes next." That's how it started, right there in the mud with blood on my shirt. I should back up some. My name is Harlan Briggs, and for 37 years I had been the one nobody talked about when they talked about the Briggs brothers. That's not a complaint, just a fact. Callum was the one who laughed at the right moment and shook every hand in the room and made men twice his age feel like they'd said something wise. He could do that. Walk into a place and make it feel fuller. I was the one who kept the books and mended the fence line and woke before first light every morning of my life without anyone asking me to. We had a ranch. Our father left it to both of us, which was his way of leaving it to Callum and trusting me to make it run. I didn't resent that. I understood it. The world works on men like Callum. It always had. I just worked on the world. We looked alike enough to confuse people. Same height, same coloring, same shape through the jaw. But Callum had a way of holding himself, kind of wide and easy and ready, and I'd spent 30 years going narrow by comparison. Not on purpose. Just that's how it came out. When you stand next to a fire long enough, you stop noticing how cold you are. In March of that year, Callum had written to a matchmaking concern out of St. Louis. He told me about it the way he told me about most things, halfway through, like I already knew the first half. Said he'd paid the fee and picked out a woman from their book and sent his photograph and that she'd be coming in late April. He showed me her letter. Her name was Nora Voss, and she'd written in a hand that was small and even no loops, nothing fancy. She said she was 32, a widow, that she'd had half a farm in Ohio until a flood took it, that she was not afraid of work or weather or plain living, and that she expected the same from a husband. I remember thinking she sounded like someone who meant every word she said. Then the first week of April, Callum fell from a horse he had no business riding, a big gray stallion he'd bought against my recommendation, and broke his leg in 2 places and cracked 2 ribs to boot. He spent the first 10 days in bed at Doc Prute's and the next 6 weeks on the settle with his leg in a board splint. He couldn't write. He could barely think straight from the pain for a while there. And somewhere in all of that, the letter he was supposed to send Nora Voss, the one telling her which coach stop to take, the one with the corrected directions, never got sent. I didn't know that until she was already standing in my yard. I made up the back bedroom for her. It wasn't much, a cot, a washstand, a window that faced the creek. She looked it over and said it would do. I heated water for her on the stove and brought it up in the big tin basin, and by the time I came back down, she had already started a pot of coffee on the fire like she'd been in that kitchen 3 years. I didn't know what to make of her. I sent a rider up to Whitmore Creek that evening to find Callum. He was staying up there with a woman named Estelle Morrow, who was a widow herself and who had been nursing him in a way that had become, from what I understood, somewhat more than medicinal. The rider came back the next afternoon. Callum's response, written in Estelle's hand because he still couldn't hold a pen well, said more or less, "Harlan, I'm sorry, I should have written Nora myself, but things have gotten complicated up here. Take care of her. I'll sort it all out soon." Nora read that letter sitting at my kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at her hands for a moment. "He's with someone else," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sounds like." She was quiet a while. I stood at the stove pretending to check on something. "Did you know?" she asked. When he wrote to me, did you know there was someone else?" "I didn't know about any of it until you drove up." She looked at me then, just looked like she was deciding something about me. Whether I was telling the truth, I suppose. I held still and let her look. "All right," she said finally, and that was it. She picked up her coffee and drank what was left, cold as it was, and said, "I'll need to know what needs doing tomorrow." What needed doing was considerable. The ranch was in that particular state that happens when one man has been keeping everything together alone for too long. The fence along the east pasture was sound. The well was sound. The house was functional. But the garden I'd never gotten back to since my wife passed 3 years before, the one that Miriam had kept, was just a rectangle of hard dirt with last year's stakes still in it. The barn roof had a low spot over the stalls that I'd been meaning to shore up. There were accounts I was behind on, not badly, but enough to feel it. Nora looked the place over that first morning the way a person sizes up a hand of cards. Then she said, "The roof first, before any rain gets in." I said I agreed. She said, "I can work up there if you show me what you need." I said I'd get up there myself. She said, "I've reshingled half a barn roof before. I'm not soft." I believed her, she wasn't soft. But I wasn't about to put a woman I'd known for 2 days on a barn roof, so I said I'd get it done, and I did, while she worked the garden plot and got the soil turned. I watched her from up top. She had a way of working, unhurried, steady, nothing wasted. She'd pick a thing up and not put it down until she knew what to do with it. After a while, it got to where I was watching her more than I was watching what my hands were doing, which is how I hit my own thumb with the roofing mallet. I did not make a sound. I just held my thumb until the worst of it passed. When I came down, she looked at my hand. I hadn't said anything and said, "That's going to be black by morning." She went inside and came back with a rag soaked in cold well water and wrapped it without being asked. She did it matter-of-factly, no fuss, like wrapping a man's smashed thumb was just something that needed doing. That was the first time she touched me. The days settled into a kind of shape. She was up before I was most mornings, which I hadn't expected. I'd come down and the fire would already be going and there'd be coffee on and whatever she decided we were having for breakfast. She'd found Miriam's old herb jars in the back of the pantry and started using them, and the kitchen smelled different. Alive again, I suppose, was how I thought of it. I noticed that more than I wanted to. We didn't talk much at first, not because there was anything wrong, just because neither of us seemed to need it. She'd say what needed saying, and I'd say what I had to say, and we'd work side by side, and that was enough. There's a particular comfort in that, with the right person not having to fill every silence. I hadn't felt it in a long time. We ate supper together every evening. The first week it was a little careful. She'd ask me things about the ranch, about the county, about the water rights dispute I'd been into with the Ketterman spread for 2 years. I told her what I knew, and she listened the way not many people listen, like she was actually going to do something with what I told her. One evening about 2 weeks and she said, "You don't talk about Callum." I said no. She said, "Why is that?" I said, "Not much to say about him that you haven't already figured out." She considered that. That's one of the loneliest things I've ever heard someone say. I didn't have an answer to that. We ate for a while in quiet. Then she said, "You've been keeping this place together by yourself." I said since Miriam died, mostly yes. She said, "How long ago was that?" 3 years, I said. She looked at the table. "I'm sorry." "She was a good woman." "She must have been," Nora said, "the way you said that." The trouble with Ketterman came to a head in early May. He had 3 hired men, and he'd been edging his fence line over onto the south quarter of my range for the better part of 2 years, a few rods at a time, slow enough that proving it in any court would cost more than the land was worth. I knew what he was doing. He knew I knew. It was the kind of quiet aggression that depends on the other man being alone and tired. I rode out to meet them when they started moving fence posts again. One of Ketterman's men, a thick-necked fellow named Yude, got down off his horse and said some things he probably shouldn't have said, and when I didn't answer the way he expected, he moved toward me. I broke 2 of his fingers with a fence post before he got close enough to matter. Ketterman himself had the decency to stay on his horse. He told me to leave well enough alone or it would go worse for me next time, and I told him that if I found another post moved on the south quarter, I would be in front of Judge Maynard in Dellard's Crossing by the following morning with 18 months of survey records. That got quiet. He looked at me a long time, and then he reined his horse around and his men followed. I came home with a split knuckle and Nora met me at the door. She looked at my hand, then at my face. "Ketterman," she said. I said yes. She said, "Did you settle it?" I said I thought so. She stepped back and let me in. While I washed the knuckle at the basin, she stood in the doorway and said, "I overheard Hicks at the feed store last week. He was talking about how you've been letting that situation slide." I told him he had the wrong man. I looked at her. She said simply, "He did." That was all. She went back to what she'd been doing, and I stood there a moment with the water running, and I felt something move in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. Or maybe pride exactly, the kind that comes from someone who sees you clearly saying out loud that you are what you are. Callum wrote in late May. He was going to marry Estelle Morrow. He apologized, again in his way, which was to say, thoroughly, warmly, with good intentions that cost him nothing. He wanted to know if Nora was all right. He said he felt terrible. He said he hoped we'd all remain on good terms. I read the letter and set it on the table, and Nora came in from the garden and read it too. When she finished, she put it down and looked at me and said, "He wants to know if I'm all right." "So it seems. Are you going to write back?" I said I hadn't decided. She was quiet a moment, standing there with a smear of garden dirt on the back of her wrist. Then she said, "Harlan, I need to say something to you." I waited. She said, "I came out here to make a practical life with a practical man who knew what work was. I didn't expect much beyond that." She looked at me straight, not sideways, not soft. "I got a great deal more than I expected." I said, "Nora." She said, "I am not confused. I am not grateful and making it out to be something more. I know the difference." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "You have been the steadiest person I've known since my husband died. You've asked nothing of me except honest work. You've been good." She put her hands flat on the table. "I'd like to stay if you want me here." The light was coming through the kitchen window the way it does in late afternoon, going sideways across the table. I looked at her hands on the table, and I thought of all the women who'd married men like Callum, and found, eventually, that a man who makes a room feel alive doesn't necessarily make a life feel solid. I said, "I want you here." She nodded once, like we'd settled on something fair, which I suppose we had. We were married by Judge Maynard in June, in the same courthouse where I'd threatened Ketterman. We didn't make much of it. Nora wore the better of her 2 dresses, and I put on my good shirt, and we had the Prestons from the next spread over as witnesses, Carl Preston and his wife Dolores, who cried a little and kept apologizing for it. Judge Maynard read the words in the flat way he read everything, and when he got to the part where Nora was to say whether she would take me, she said, "I will," in a voice that carried clear to the back of the room, like she wanted there to be no confusion. I put my grandmother's ring on her finger. It had been my grandmother's, then Miriam's, and now I was giving it again, and I will not pretend that didn't sit in my chest with some weight to it. Nora felt me hesitate, I think, because she pressed her other hand over mine for just a moment. After Carl drove us back in his wagon because ours had a wheel that needed tending, and Dolores kept talking all the way, which was fine because neither Nora nor I felt the need to say much. When they dropped us at the gate, Nora thanked Dolores, and I shook Carl's hand, and we walked up the yard together in the early evening light, and Nora said, "The wheel." I said I'd get to it tomorrow. She said, "I know you will." We went inside. "I want to tell you about a thing that happened about a month after we married, because I think it is more the truth of it than any of the rest." I'd been into Dellard's Crossing to pick up a load of feed and run some errands, and while I was at the general store, Tom Hicks was there, the same Hicks who'd been saying I'd let the Ketterman thing slide. He looked at me over the counter and he said, in the way men say things when they're trying to be decent but haven't quite worked out how, "Heard you and Callum's bride got married." I said we'd gotten married, yes. He said, well, he thought about it. Callum was always the one people figured would end up with the best of everything. He didn't mean it as it landed. I know Tom Hicks and he's not a cruel man. But it landed anyway, and I kept my face easy and I said, "Seems like it worked out." I drove home. Nora met me in the yard when I pulled up, the way she'd taken to doing in the evenings when she heard the wagon. She helped me with the bags from the back, and we carried them inside together. And when we'd set them on the kitchen table, she turned and looked at me. She could always tell I'd found when something had happened. She didn't ask me right then. She put the feed away and she put the dry goods away and she started the supper. And after a while, when I was at the table going through the mail, she set a cup of coffee in front of me without being asked and put her hand on the back of my neck for just a moment. Just rested it there, warm and still, and then went back to the stove. I sat there with my hands around the cup. I've thought about that moment more than I've thought about the wedding or the day she showed up or most of what else has happened since. A hand at the back of a man's neck. Nothing said, nothing performed for anybody. Just, I see you, I'm here, you're not alone. You get to a certain age and you understand that's the thing. That's the whole of it. Not the grand gesture, not the declaration in front of witnesses, not any of that. It's the person who looks at you at the end of an ordinary day and decides that where you are is where they want to be. Callum and Estelle came through in August, on their way down to visit her people in Tucson. We fed them supper. Callum was Callum, big in the room, easy with his laugh, talking about the house he was going to build and the horses he was going to run, and all the things he was going to do that Callum always talked about and sometimes even did. He was happy, I think. Genuinely. He and Estelle seemed well matched in the way that easy people are well matched with easy people. He and I walked out to the barn after supper while the women talked. He looked the place over and said it was in good shape, and I said it was getting there. He said he was glad. He meant it. After a moment he said, "She suits you." I said, "Yes." He looked out at the dark past the barn door. "I don't think she would have suited me." He wasn't wrong about that, and I didn't say so. He said, "I'm sorry, Harlan, for the mess I made of the whole thing." I said, "It worked out." He nodded, he was quiet a moment. Then he said, "You were always the better man for this kind of thing, I never said it." I looked at him, my brother who was exactly what he'd always been, honest enough when the moment asked for it. I said, "I know." And I meant that plain, not as a jab, I did know. I'd always known, some part of me. It had just taken a woman arriving on the wrong coach to make it something other than a quiet fact I kept to myself. They left the next morning. The fall came in dry and then cold, a hard cold that settled in early and stayed. I got the barn roof finished and the south fence shored up against the winter, and I cut a winter's worth of wood while there was still enough warm in the days to work. Nora put up 17 quarts of apple preserves and 4 of blackberry, and she repaired the porch screen I'd been meaning to get to since March. One evening in October, we sat on the porch after supper. First frost was still a few weeks off, but the air had that metal smell that means it's coming. The sky was clear and the stars were out, and the land was quiet the way it gets quiet in autumn, like it's settling in. Nora had a mending basket in her lap. I had my coffee. We sat. After a while she said, "Are you happy, Harlan?" I thought about it honest, the way she always made me think. I said, "I think I'm the best I've been in a long time. That might be the same thing." She looked at me with that straight look, and there was something warm in it that she didn't often let show quite so plain. "Good," she said. She went back to her mending. I held my coffee and looked out at my land, at the dark of the east pasture and the line of the fence I'd fixed and the barn roof I'd done right, and I thought, this is mine, not just the ground, all of it. The work and what it built, and the woman sitting next to me who knew exactly who she'd chosen and had chosen anyway. I've never needed more than that. You stack your days the right way, do the honest thing, take care of what's in your keeping. There are women who see that, who know what it means, who aren't looking for the easy man or the loud one or the one who fills a room. Nora Briggs knew a solid thing when she found one. I'd spent 37 years being the Briggs who stayed and worked and kept the accounts and mended the lines. I spent one morning being the wrong Briggs on a muddy porch. I've spent every day since being the right one,